Welcome to Collision, the podcast where we discuss the fun and sometimes complicated collision of real life and trusting God. If you're curious or confused about how to engage the world we live in, we hope our conversation here helps. Now, let's get into this episode of Collision.
Well, welcome to the Collision podcast. I'm Matt Manning, the pastor here at Crossroads Church, and I am joined with my esteemed co-host,
wow.
Stu Jackson.
I feel like I owe you money now that you're saying I'm esteemed. So
well, this is episode 3, and it appears that Saul didn't take you out. And
no. In fact, he didn't even call me. I was hoping for some wings.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I did speak to him, and he told me that he heard that he got mentioned in the last podcast, but he said, there's a difference between being mentioned and actually sitting in the chair. And I said, no, I get that. And so it's your chair.
Oh, well, we can get him another chair if he wants to sit across the room and watch.
He can push the button on the camera.
You're welcome to come start the record button. That's all.
That's right. This is a two-man team right here.
Absolutely, it is.
Not a lot of tech going on here. And
he and Doug can stand in the back and warn us when we're out of time.
That's right. You guys need to shut it down. So last week, kind of fun story. After the podcast, my dad gives me this call. And he's just like dying laughing. Like he can't even get words out of his mouth. He's laughing so hard. And eventually he tells me this story that he's with my nephew, whose name is Cord. And Cord's like, my dad was saying that he needed help with a project, and Cord's like, why don't you call Uncle Matt? He only works on Sunday mornings, right? And so this is why my dad's just like dying laughing, is because this is what Cord believes. And so Cord's like, Uncle Matt, what is it that you actually do as a pastor? And so I kind of share what I had done on Wednesday, including the recording of this podcast, and there were some other pretty big items that I had been working on. And I get done sharing, and he looks at me and he goes, geez, man. He's like, you're like the mayor out there. And so, you're my co-host, and you get to sit with the mayor of Colorado, at least according to Cord Henry, my nephew.
God bless Cord Henry. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Mayor Matt. I'm here with Mayor Matt Manning.
That's
the
it.
triple M. That almost sounds like a wrestling name.
That's right.
From your childhood home of Kentucky,
right.
Straight from the wilds of Kentucky, Mayor Matt Manning.
It's coming off the top rope with the elbows.
Yeah, right.
Well, today we wanted to maybe get a little political, for better or worse.
For better or worse.
And talk a little bit of Doge.
Now, question, is it Doge or is it dog-y? Because I've debated this internally, and I know these are things that people are like, what is wrong with you?
Yes.
And in fact, I hear that a lot from my wife. What is wrong with you?
That makes sense.
But is it Doge or it government? So it's dog-y. I don't know. I'm just saying it's political.
It could be. We could debate
either.
that all day.
We could.
These are the deep thoughts of Stu Jackson.
You know what? I will call
This
Elon.
is why you're in that chair right there.
That's right. Far enough away that you're like, stay away from me.
This is it. Yeah, I don't know. I call it Doge.
That's what I've always thought, but for whatever reason, it was stuck in my head the other night.
Well, we can call it doggy.
Is it doggy or Doge? Or I suppose it depends on who you talk to and how they feel about it.
Which is, all over the board. And so what we're talking about, if you don't know, since President Trump became the president on January 20th, he instituted something that he ran on quite regularly. It was a big part of his campaign, which was this Department of Government Efficiency. That's what Doge stands for.
Absolutely.
And it has had he instituted it, put it in place, and it has had a wide array of emotional reaction to it.
And it is incredible to talk to people about it, and the reactions are all over the board from, heck yeah, let's do it, let's go forward, damn the torpedoes, and then there's the consummate eye roll. Yep. That it looks like people got a cash register in their head and their eyes just keep going around. Yeah. And then there's the anger from it. And it's incredible.
Well, before I got on, I kind of looked up a very recent poll just of yesterday from NBC News. And the polling was pretty fascinating. NBC News is not like, a bastion of conservative push. But
really, I wasn't aware of that.
What their poll showed is that about 33% of Americans think that Doge is doing a good job and should keep going. 28% of Americans say that what Doge is doing is probably needed, but they need to slow down and be less chaotic. And then 33% of Americans say that what Doge is doing is actually harmful and it needs to stop. And then you have 4% of Americans who say that the size of government is just fine and the spending within government is just fine. And what I found interesting about that poll, is that actually 96% of Americans have some level of discomfort when it comes to the size of our government and, how much money is being spent within our government. And, we're at this place where we're $36 trillion in debt, which if you just divide that by every American means that we just owe $100,000 just to get even. That's not even to move us forward with funding the government. It's just $100,000 that every single one of us owes just in order for us to break even. That is an insane amount of money.
And that doesn't include the continued function. That's just, right. You got to fork over $100,000 for the sheer joy of it all.
Yeah, just to get us back to zero. And so, as you've already spoken a little bit about it, but as you've at a personal level, within your family or friend group, or, even within your work as, an internet security guy, what has been the reaction to Doge in your world?
It's all over the board. For me, it's all over the board.
Yeah.
Because well, first of all, the economics of it all and the way the finances work, I feel like they talk to my kids. I feel like it's my kids trying to run it. Well, just give me money, and everything will be fine.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure that's how I would imagine your kids operate. In fact, I know your kids, and right. I'm pretty sure one of them's like, "Dad, just give me money."
Actually, Mercy, we pay our kids allowance, and we pay it based on their age. If they're 12, they get $12 a week if they do all their chores. Nice. And we kind of set it up in such a way that if you don't do your chores, then at the end of the month, you actually have to pay Dad for doing your chores. And so this is how this works. And what we've said is that the reason that you get allowance is so that when you go out with your friends, it's on you. You pay for it, Dad's not going to pay. And so Mercy comes up to my wife, Sarah, while I was out last week, and she was going to a hockey game. And she asked my wife if Sarah would like to invest in her hockey experience on Saturday. And my wife, Sarah, goes, no, you can invest in your own hockey experience. But anyways, it was,
I'll FaceTime you and show you everything that you've purchased. That's fantastic. Right. So I'm going to borrow that one from Mercy. Yes. Would you like to invest in my experience?
Yes.
Well, no, getting back to the whole situation with the Department of Governmental Efficiency.
Yeah.
It really is all over the board. For me personally, it's hard. It's hard to watch. Mm-hmm. All this money, and I struggle with how much we're taxed.
Yeah.
Hey, you made money. I'm going to take some taxes. Hey, you're spending money. Hey, we're going to take some taxes.
Right.
Oh, hey, by the way, you own that. You need to pay for some taxes. It's like, wait a minute. So then to find out that the money is being used in ways that I may not agree with, that's really hard. Yeah. And, government is a struggle anyways.
Yep.
Because, you look and you can, it's such an emotional issue. That's the hardest part for me. Yeah. Because you can look back and it's a lot like, and I hate to say it, it's a lot like the Bible. People can cherry pick situations in history and say, see, they did the same thing without any context.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the random Bible verse that somebody throws in your face and says, see?
Yeah.
Now, wait a minute. Let's talk about what that actually meant.
Yeah.
And so you're like that. And I feel like it's that way with people I talk to. There are some people that, like you said, are, charge forth, let's go.
Yeah.
We're going to, let's burn down everything and we'll start over.
Yeah.
And then there's other people that are just appalled that we would even consider doing anything because the government obviously knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those that it really kind of ties you into knots and you're not sure what way to think about it, at least from my perspective.
Yeah.
So,
and I think, there's that one piece of us that goes, that there's spending, and there's always spending, whether it be at a governmental level or a nonprofit level, or even within a business, that it's like, I don't know that I would do it that way. I disagree with the way that the money is being spent. And so there's that, but then there's also just some of the things that have shown up that have just been surprising in terms of waste, where you look at it and you go, man. And so I don't know what's been surprising to you, but one of the most surprising things to me is when the statistic came out that we have like 390 people on the rolls of Social Security. Not that we're paying 390 million people for Social Security, but that's who would or could be eligible for it.
Right,
and there's only
right.
341 million people who live in the United States. And it's like, at some level, like that math ain't mathing, you know? And
Can't imagine
and so
why you'd
it's
think
not
that was wrong,
It's not
man.
whether I agree or disagree with Social Security, like, you know, at a basic level, it's probably needed.
Right.
And so I don't disagree with Social Security, but when the math doesn't math, like I got some questions, and I would like somebody to figure out
Especially
what those answers are.
You know, in the next, I don't know, 20, 25 years, you may be looking at that. I have some questions about.
This is right. I'm 20 years away from Social Security, and so I would like there to be a little bit left.
That would be nice, especially when all of my retirement calculators say your 401k and Social Security. Wait a minute, is that going to be there? I have some questions.
So maybe what's one of the what's been one of the, like the surprising things for you as you've kind of
the hardest part for me is the programs that they have found that may not fit into my idea of things that are really important for a country to be worried about.
Yes.
And I struggle personally with the giving other countries money for programs like, you know, there's so many of them. It's hard to
whatever
list.
They are. Yeah.
You know, there's so many of just the random things like, okay, in Africa, let's study, you know, X. And it's like, really?
Should we?
How many millions of dollars have you spent on that? That's where I've really struggled.
Yeah.
Is just the amount of money that's just kind of thrown away. And I get the feeling of pet projects. Ooh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's do that. What a great idea. Time out, you know. It's the same thing, but I'm sure, you know, there are people that think the same thing of what I would have a pet project. So I can't, I don't blame anybody in general, but I blame the group as a whole.
Yes.
You know, we have these people that we elect to represent us, and there is no representation.
Yeah. And there seems to be at the core right now within our society and country, like what is the actual function of government?
Right.
Like what does it mean to govern? And is it just like a high level, right, where you care for the country and the infrastructure, you make sure that there's roads and gas stations and, you know, that people can vote and, you know, taxes are collected so that those things can happen? Or is the role of government at a deeper level where there is social services that are provided within the country, and then even a deeper level, which would go to like, how much are we responsible for other countries? And there is this deep philosophy, I think, at the core of all of this that's being challenged of what does government look like. And the problem is you have 340 million people trying to go, this is what it should be.
And you look at it, and what's fascinating to me is how many times have you heard that if you're doomed to repeat history if you don't understand it?
Yes.
I'm pretty sure, and you know, I'm a computer guy, but you know, I tried to pay attention in history classes and everything as I was younger. I'm pretty sure the United States kind of came into being because the founding fathers fled the overbearing government of where they were from.
They threw a lot of tea in the ocean.
They did throw a lot of tea in the ocean. I'd like to throw some of the tea around here, maybe, you know. But to make a bigger hit, we would have to throw Monster or something like that in the ocean and watch. You got to get the younger people involved.
Yeah. So speaking of history, and maybe even turning it to a little bit like theologically, one of the things that's been really fascinating to watch from a pastor's seat is like the surprise that people have had that this is where the government's at. Like how could this happen? And you know, as we were talking beforehand, like theologically, as you look through the scriptures, we have this presence in the Old Testament that is known as Babylon, right? It was this country, and the country was evil. The country did things that were, you know, evil in the sight of the Lord. And over time, throughout the scriptures, Babylon becomes really the personification of evil in the scriptures. And beyond just the simple country that we see in the Old Testament, it just becomes, in the Old Testament and then into the New, this personification of evil. And what's fascinating about Babylon is that really it is the story of every superpower ever, from the Greeks to the Romans to the English Empire to what I would even argue is modern day America, even though we don't like to think of ourselves as this way, that we are truly Babylon, and that eventually every Babylon in the scriptures is swallowed up by two things. One, kind of this hunger for war, where we have to expand, and there's this hunger to try to control as much territory and land as possible, and this overwhelming amount of greed. And those two things combined eventually swallows up the Babylons. And you can see it throughout the history, and it's seen even in the scriptures. Like, we're told that this is what's happening. And it's actually the great warning of Revelation is that, that this is the personification of Babylon will eventually eat itself, right? And then fall in the end days to the wrath of God. And so, I look at America, and particularly what we're going through right now, and like, I don't have a lot of surprise. I'm disappointed,
Right.
but I don't have a lot of
absolutely.
surprise because theologically, everything aligns to the United States being the superpower of this day and age, and eventually every superpower succumbs to itself and becomes Babylon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you look at it, and I'm not calling people evil.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into the they're evil, we're good. That I don't want to get into that discussion or anything. But if you look at it, you and I had a conversation earlier. Man is inherently evil. Mm-hmm. That's just, unfortunately, that's the way it is.
Yeah, from Genesis chapter 3, right? Like, the first sin is all of our sins.
There's this book that covered this. I don't remember what it was called, but man is inherently evil, and so now man is trying to lead something and be good.
Yeah,
and that's good in air quotes.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
You're asking an evil person to do something good and worthy and all that stuff, and it just built into that, just built into our very nature. That's a seemingly impossible task.
Yeah.
And especially when you're not everybody's on the same page, and you start throwing in those other desires and needs and wants and everything else. Babylon is a scary thought.
It is. And the opposite of Babylon, at least in our culture, what we think is that, well, we need to become a theocracy, right? Like what Israel had in the Old Testament. And yet the reality is that theocracy isn't the answer, because theocracy, we can watch Israel and their cycle of trusting in God. Good times came, less trusting God. Great times came, less trusting God. All of a sudden now they're walking in their own ways and, going down the road of evil, and all of this falls upon them, and they go, God, where are you at? We need you, right? And then a prophet would come in, or a judge or a king, and bring them back to repentance and start the circle, and they would fall in their dependence upon God, and the whole cycle would begin again. And it's like we saw the theocracy, and the theocracy wasn't the answer, and yet it feels like, at least in modern day America, from what I would call like the Christian right, is like this return to a theocracy, and go, man, if we just kind of came to this theocracy, then everything would be good.
Sure.
And I don't know that bears itself out. I think that what maybe bears itself out is ultimately man is transformed from the inside out in a relationship with Christ.
In that theocracy, that's an interesting idea with everything that's going on. Is and we talked about this in podcast 1.
Yeah.
Which you should have watched by now. But we started talking about seeing more of the acknowledgement of God in people's lives, and in particular public figures.
Yeah.
We talked about sports, but you're starting to see it in other places. Even President Trump managed to bring that in several places.
Yeah.
During his inauguration festivities and stuff like that. Things that I personally felt maybe were missing in areas. So you're starting, you talk about that theocracy, and that kind of that circle, and it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And maybe we're following that circle and headed back a different direction, because hey, there for a while things were great. There's no denying, man. Everybody was living the high life, and things were great, and things continue to be so great, and it's so great, and then what happened?
Yeah.
because the greatness can't continue without.
Yeah, when men start to looking inward as
Right.
their own God,
Right.
that's when things fall apart, which I think is, that's not just a return to a theocracy. Like the answer is not that we just post the 10 Commandments in the schools. Like the Israelites always had the 10 Commandments, and what they did was manage to break them.
Yes.
Over and over and over again. Right?
Seen the movie.
And that's not the answer, right? The answer is ultimately like, if you want a changed world, you need to start with a changed man.
Right.
And the only change that is a meaningful change is ultimately the ones that we find in Christ, and where Christ starts to transform us. And only then, with, as we are being transformed, truly submitted to who Jesus is in every area of our life, which again, every single one of us falls short of time and time again. This is why, like, even the best of intentions of man are nothing but dirty rags before God's, right?
Absolutely.
And so, but that may be, for Christians, while we should pay attention to the government, while we should be for efficiencies in the government, and making sure that money is managed well, or all of those kind of things, that at the end of the day, what we really ought to be spending most of our time is not worrying about what Doge is finding, but on our knees praying that revival would happen in this country.
Sure.
And that through that revival, eyes would be opened, and that we would come to an understanding of what is actual government supposed to look like in
Right.
the eyes of God.
Right.
And how are we supposed to live, and how do we handle our money? Because, the Bible has a lot to say about how we handle money.
I'll be honest, it's phenomenal how much the Bible has to say.
Yeah.
And I'm still learning.
Yeah.
I can't claim to have any sort of deep knowledge of the Bible. My relationship with it is still growing.
Yeah.
And is still new. I'd love to say that I've read it cover to cover 33 times, and I can quote you Bible verses. Go ahead and name a Bible verse, and I'll quote it back to you.
Yeah.
I got John 3:16, and I'm about done.
At least you got that one.
I can probably give you Genesis 1, verse 1.
You should read John 3:17. That one's really good.
3:17.
Yeah. That's right.
Whoa. But when you start looking at these things, this is not a new problem. This government efficiency is not a new problem. It's in the time of the Israelites and all that stuff. I mean, you talk about Babylon. These were things that were happening then. Mm-hmm. We're not inventing new things here. We're watching the same thing happen over and over again. And looking at it as a microcosm of what's going on in the government, I see that a lot in churches too. Mm. That there are churches, and thank God not ours, that have struggled with these kind of things as well, with the financials of it all.
Yes. Yeah, there's no shortage of examples of churches handling money poorly, evilly, badly.
I don't know. Evilly sounded good to me. Evilly,
whatever that is. Yes. Who have not handled their finances the way that God would want them to.
Right, and that's, so you look at it, and that's a struggle. Of all places, we're sitting here and we're trying to bring the biblical perspective and the Christian perspective into stuff, and with the intention that people think about it. Mm-hmm. I don't think you're sitting here. I'm certainly not sitting here because the last thing I want is somebody to take, what I say as some sort of, ironclad, I gotcha. But is to get people to think. So you look at it and you look at men of God, mm-hmm. who you assume pastors and people who are lead church are, and you see similar things happening.
Yeah. That's one of the biggest critiques, right? Is the way the church has handled money.
So you as a pastor sitting in your mayor chair.
Yes.
Mayor Matt Manning.
Thank you, Cord Henry.
Cord Henry. That's awesome. I'm going to pass that along to Dave too.
Your father-in-law.
My father-in-law, next time you see him, it's going to be Mayor Matt. That's going to be awesome. Yeah. But sitting in your chair with the challenges that you have, and I've been graced enough to be part of the church council here and get a small picture.
Yeah.
I have no illusions and honestly, me with money is probably not, that's why my wife does the books at home, guys.
Yeah.
Me with money is a terrible thing. But from your chair, how does a church go through something and not run into these, things like that? Because you sit in a really unique place in our society because a lot of people look to you. Mm-hmm. Whether you want it or not, congratulations. I don't know if you were aware of that. But how do you sit from where you're at and where you lead and where your heart is with all of these financial things going on and the emotions and everything around it?
Yeah.
How do churches survive, and how do you tell people what God has said about it and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, I think that from a larger church perspective, that transparency is key. People are giving money, and thankfully, in the almost 65 years of Crossroads, we've never had a financial indiscretion, controversy of that. It's in large part, I would say, because of in those 65 years, there's only been 3 pastors at Crossroads Church, and the 2 that were before me were incredible men of integrity. Mm-hmm. That kind of set the stage for this is the way that we're going to do things. And so in this church, right, we have a separate board that we call our trustees, that take a look at the finances every month. We have checks and balances to make sure that money is going where money says that it's going. We have a church council that has to approve, the yearly budget. Like the staff doesn't handle that. I just don't say, hey, look, this is how we're going to do it this year, right? Like the church council has oversight over that. And then ultimately our congregation has to vote whether that's the budget that we move forward with or not. And we have measures in place of how much we can spend on staffing, how much we spend on ministry, how much we spend on missions, right? How much we save. And all of that is to create transparency, where people can ask the questions. We're never offended by the questions. We do an audit every year to go, hey, look, according to accounting principles, we are where we should be.
Sure.
And so we work really hard at making sure that from a financial spot, that we're above reproach. That's the language that we use when it comes to our finances. And I think that, when it comes to the scriptures, like I said, the scriptures have a lot to say when it comes to money. And here at Crossroads, we've never shied away from what the scriptures say. And so every couple of years, we do a money sermon series. We did one at the beginning of this year where we just talked through, this is what God says about money. And if this is the way that we're to organize our own lives around these principles, then we ought to do that at an organizational level as well. Sure. And I think that, it can be and is a very slippery slope when it comes to money, right? That things that are good, right? You give a little bit of money here, and then you can, squeeze some money over here, and pretty soon you need, what would that be? Coj? The church,
the
church of efficiency. Yeah, the church. Wait, it would be doke,
or dosa.
Yeah, dosa. So whatever it is, right? That pretty soon you need to find yourself into that. And I think that one of the cool things that we have when it comes to our church council is that our church council is not made up of a bunch of people who are just yes men and women to me, but rather, and nor is the trustees, but rather people willing to ask questions, even hard questions.
Sure.
And that in and of itself is a huge deal, because when you're just surrounded with a bunch of yes people, that's when the pastor becomes, the prophet coming off the mountaintop who can do no wrong.
Right.
And that's the slippery slope pretty quick.
And it's interesting that we're kind of in this point. I spent a few weeks with my kids this past month and going to their churches and hearing conversations that people have about their churches. I'm more in tune with what's going on today, and being on church council and stuff, I'm kind of like, oh, what does this church do?
Yeah.
And I've been fascinated because I heard somebody talk to me, and my wife was in on the conversation too, about a church that it's the lead pastor. That's it.
Yeah.
That is the authority that runs the whole thing. And then there's other churches that you hear them talk about elder boards and councils and do all that stuff. So it's really interesting that dichotomy is still out there.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to run a church.
Because it's just, there's no one way to do it.
Right.
Right. And we're talking about transparency, and we're talking about it here, and going outside of these church walls for families and stuff like that. I feel like that transparency is something that can translate at all aspects of our lives, because you have these, if you have these hidden things, this is a lesson that I feel like everybody can take regardless of their position in life. Is here you have this big uproar about what's happening with Elon Musk and President Trump, and you can name all the way down. You have this huge uproar about money being, used in really kind of sketchy ways at times, and you have one group of people saying this is great, and other people saying, "Are you crazy?"
Yeah.
But if you take it down to the personal level, because it's really easy to shout at the sky.
Yeah.
When you're not really super affected with it, right?
Right.
You can have an opinion when you're not really standing in the middle of it.
When you're not responsible.
But what happens when you're responsible for the money in your house?
Mm-hmm.
That's one of those things that I try and keep in mind. Is it either irritates me, or I just shake my head and go, whatever.
Yeah.
People, go write whatever you want on the side of a Tesla. That's just a really. I can't wrap my mind around that.
Yeah. And that's where I think where we stated a bit ago is that ultimately transformation starts in the person, right? And once we begin to transform and pay attention to the things that we're responsible with in our personal life, and then we expand that out to the organizations and businesses that we're involved in, which then expands out to the cities, then to ultimately the states, then to the government, and then, of the nation, and then eventually to the world. And it's like transformation starts in the heart of man. Right. And so we can get upset, and maybe at times rightfully so, this righteous indignation about what's going on in the world. And yet in those moments when we see that, if we're moved to anger, I think Jesus's words to us would be that that we're nothing more than the Pharisee in that moment.
Right.
And if we're moved towards a place of compassion and going, man, sin has infiltrated the world to this degree and it breaks our hearts, then that's really the heart of Jesus. And, and however we land in that. And so, the reality is that you and I probably could talk all day about Doge.
We could.
But
are we tapping on our time? I got another. I'm going to throw this off a little bit because I know, in all transparency, keyword, we do talk about this before we start recording.
Yep.
But one of the things that I've struggled with over the past week, thinking about this, trying to figure it out, is always an image that comes back to my head for a variety of reasons. But it's Christ in the temple, and you have all the people that are, the tax collectors and stuff in the temple.
Yeah.
And he gets frustrated, and he walks up, and he flips that table, and then he grabs a whip. Tell me if I'm wrong. This is the story in my head.
This is the money changers. Yep.
The money changers, and he flips that table and he tells them to get out.
Yeah.
And I think about that because, first of all, people need to understand I am not calling Elon Musk or Donald Trump or anybody else and comparing them with our Lord and Savior. Yeah. I'm not.
Yeah.
But if you look at that and you take that and you look in your heart and you start talking about those money changers in the temple, I think that maybe there was another lesson in there that Christ was trying to communicate with us, and that's, where is your heart? Yeah. We talk about what is your God in your life, and for so many people it's financial.
Yeah,
it truly is, and that's
to the point in that story that people turned the house of worship into a place of commerce where they could be rich.
Right. And here's Christ saying, And so my challenge to our 100 people that listen to this, you should be sharing this, just so you know. Share it with somebody. I don't even care if they watch it. Share it with them. But my challenge to you is to look in your own temple, in your heart. Mm-hmm. Ask yourself, what is your God? What is really controlling you?
Yeah.
And if it's not Christ, if you haven't given your heart to Christ, and it's a hard thing. Mm-hmm. You know, this is not an easy thing. But maybe it's time to take that table and flip it over.
Yes.
And do that and use this lesson that the rest of society is starting to learn about, mm-hmm. Financial, terrible financial decisions and, leadership and all of these things, and look inside and take that change to heart and, go visit a church.
Yeah.
See what it's like, start opening that Bible, do things to, alter your life and take what's around you, notice it, and change your life for the better.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good word. And so if you are looking for a church and you're in the Thornton area, you can always check us out.
Absolutely.
CrossroadsABC.com. Like we said, there's a whole series on finances that we just did this January that you can check out if you want to know.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I will tell you, because usually you go to church and they say, oh, it's, let's talk about money weekend, and you can hear the collective groan. It's terrible. And this time the series, I will be honest, was probably one of the more powerful series I've ever heard on finances. So that was really good.
You. Well, like I said, you can check all that out at crossroadsabc.com. And you can catch this podcast wherever podcasts are found. And we'll be back here same time next month.
Hopefully no technical difficulties. We were a little delayed last month because some technical problems. Apparently, when the audio doesn't record, it causes problems for a podcast. I don't know. Go figure.
Right. Maybe that's a sign.
So if you guys have any suggestions, if you want to, let us know anything or whatever, it's info@crossroadsabc.com.
Yep.
We'd love to hear from people. We'd love you to share this. Go out, give it to people, post it on Facebook, post it on your socials, do whatever you can. But let's just let's reach out and touch people's lives and, hopefully make a difference.
Yep. Well, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Collision. This podcast is a production of Crossroads Church in Thornton, Colorado. For more excellent content, please visit crossroadsabc.com.